Not long ago, I was with Linda Stanley. She was trying to find some global churches that do more than just a few mission trips or pick a place in the world and do a few things. And she had a hard time finding them. I was also sitting at the desk with several world leaders at a UN thing that I'm a part of. And these are presidents and kings and queens and key leading global people, business people, so forth. There's about 30 of us in the room. Many of them have visited our church. I've been involved in various projects working with them. They're not Christians, they're Muslims, they're secularists, they're everything. And they asked me a question. They said, are there more churches like yours in America? I mean, you're an evangelical, and yet you talk to us, you have a relationship with us. Where are those churches at in America? And it really made me sad because I couldn't tell them. I was at another meeting with some key global leaders, one man who's a prince of a royal family in the Middle East, major player. You see this guy in news on frequent at different times. And he asked me, he said, I don't understand why Americans look at me and think of me as the Antichrist. I'm a man who loves God deeply with all of my heart. Now, he's a Muslim. He's not a Christian. But his perspective is, even though we disagree on religion, because he wants to follow God, though not the way you and I might, we should respect him. I think this is a challenge for us. How people perceive us, how we communicate in the world. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Gaza. I met with key government leaders, some of them obviously part of Hamas. And I asked them as I began speaking to them, there were about 25 or 30 of them sitting around this big room, and we were talking. How many of you have ever heard of an evangelical Christian? They all raised their hands. How many of you have ever met an evangelical Christian? No one raised their hand. How many of you have a negative view of evangelical Christians? They all raised their hands. And I told them, I said, well, contrary to public opinion, we are not all terrorists. Now, they died laughing, but the laughter really bemoaned the point that the reality is that to a large degree, people don't understand who we are and what we believe, and they don't have the right impression about us. Because for the most part, we as evangelicals and pastors and Christians from the West, we look at the world as a mission field instead of a community. And that is a radical difference. Why is it churches aren't global? Why are pastors not global? I think that's a question we really have to ask ourselves. And I've asked myself that. I've got a lot of answers. You know, I think some of it has to do with Western ethnocentrism. I think some pastors just don't care. There's too much they're involved in. I think for others, the Great Commission, it sounds good, but it's just too overwhelming. I think some don't understand the Great Commission. But I think more than anything else, you could put all the reasons why churches aren't more global and how they operate and how they do church. But here's what it boils down to. I think there's a failure, frankly, to understand the world that they live in. Now, when you start a church, you want to understand your community. And so you do demographics, psychographics, what do they look like? Who are the people? This matters to your church. I mean, we did Buster churches one way, Boomer churches another way, postmodern churches another way, house churches another way, all of it. Our number one context that we all share for the first time in the history of humanity is we are global. Everything is everywhere and it's now connected. What are the implications for faith? If we'll stop and think deeply about it, it'll have a profound impact upon not just how we relate to the world, but how we do church right where we are. Did you know that many of you are pastoring churches that are growing and they're filled with the world's first global generation? Let me restate that. America's first global generation. And these are generally people from their mid-teens all the way to their mid-20s. What is it that separates them? They never remember a time they weren't on the internet. They've traveled the world. They're connected to people around the world. They do business around the world. They think radically different. So their context is not just their state or their country, but it's the whole world. This has huge implications for how we do church, for how we communicate, all of it. So what do we do with all that? Well, if our context is now that all religions are all places, and they are, that changes everything radically. There was a time when religion was geographical and tribal. Not anymore. Christians are exploding in the Middle East and Muslims are exploding in the West. All religions are all places. If that's true, that fundamentally changes the way that we communicate with one another. How did Paul do it? How did the early church do it? How do churches where there's multiple cultures do it? there are clues that we can learn. Let me give you some. Here's just 6 things I'll give you real quick. Number 1, we're talking about moving from faith as interfaith to faith as multi-faith. A lot of people have the idea that they want a faith that's interfaith so that they can get along with other religions. But really, what interfaith does, it has a tendency to dumb down our faith, compromise our faith, where it's the lowest common denominator, and minimize the differences. And if we just minimize the differences, we can get along. As long as we do that, there will never be peace among the faiths in the world. And it's not hard to understand why. Here's why. Most of us that are passionate about our faith are the ones that are the most aggressive about our faith. So if instead of me compromising my faith, I can hold on to my faith, now I've moved from interfaith to multi-faith. So I'm not giving up on my faith, but I'm respecting you in your faith. And so I can believe in my faith without being fearful of you or intimidated by you. Second of all, it's a critique from your faith from others to you critiquing your faith for yourself. To a large degree, what happens, whether it's Christians critiquing Muslims or Muslims critiquing Christians, we wind up defending ourselves. Instead of doing that, we need to be brutally honest about how do we communicate with one another? What are the issues in the world? As Christians, why is it we say that we believe that God created the world, but we don't treat it properly in terms of the stewardship and the environment? Many things that we could talk about like that. Third, we have to explain our faith in such a way that the whole world gets it. For most of us, our goal is to explain our faith in such a way that our adherents and our followers get it. That's not going to work anymore. I have to be able to explain the Trinity not to a group of Christians, but to a group of Muslims and Buddhists and others in the world. And if I can't do it in a simple, understandable way, I'm going to lose the argument. Here's the great tragedy of theology today. We have made it so complex that it's the domain of a handful of theologians. For there to be a movement of the gospel in the world, theology must be so simple that anyone can grasp it and understand it. So that means for me that when I'm talking to a Muslim, I can't blow the Trinity off as a mystery. I have to be able to help them understand it. Fourth, we live out our faith at its very best. In other words, how is my faith making a difference in the world? How is it that my faith is causing things to be better? Many of my Muslim friends are blown away that I went into Gaza. And their response has been, why did you do that? And how did you do that? And my response is, because of the Christ that lives in me and what I believe about Jesus. Which leads me to the fifth thing. It's moving from a competition of faiths to a collaboration of faiths. Some of those Muslims told me, would you let me participate in what you're doing? I'd like to help fund it. One of them said, I'd like to go with you. Would you let me go with you? And I'm fine with that. Why? Because this man's my friend and we'll be talking about faith along the way. So instead of me going in, sneaking in, and trying to underhandedly do stuff, right up front, I'm an evangelical follower of Jesus who believes Jesus is who he said he was. And I want to live out my faith, and I want to serve people and see a difference made. Final thing I'd say is integrate your faith in the world so that the average person can see it and understand it. And it makes sense. Not your church faith and your rest of the weekday faith, but all of it. How do we do that? We move from focusing on the preacher and the church to focusing on the disciple and the society. I've written about that in my new book, Real Time, that comes out in a few months, deals with all of this. But that's the key. We've made the focus the preacher and the church. No, it's got to be the disciple and the society. The disciple, the lowest common denominator. The grid, the society. The disciple, the lowest common denominator. Change happens when we do that.